Okay, so I thought I'd begin just by giving a quick overview of some of the submissions that I've received so far to the inquiry. I've been astounded with the quality of the submissions submitted thus far. They've come from a variety of different people, you know, unaffiliated individuals, individual concerned citizens, peace activists, retired ADF personnel, academics, and a whole host of others. The concerns are kind of the ones that you would expect, you know, concerns about Australia being dragged into conflict again, concerns about the militarization of the region, dangers of a declining US empire and the rise of China. There's a big focus on China so far, in fact, in the submissions, which is quite understandable. And some very thoughtful submissions made about possible alternatives to Australia's defence policy as well. So I'm really pleased so far with the submissions, and I've been learning a lot by reading them. I encourage others out there who haven't made a submission yet to please do so. The submissions don't have to, you know, be large numbers of pages with detailed references. We've had submissions like that, but I've had submissions of just, you know, a paragraph long expressing certain individual concerns, and all of that is really valuable to the inquiry. So yes, I urge those who haven't submitted already to please submit your ideas. So in that light, I've thought in my presentation today that I might touch on a couple of issues that that might stimulate some kind of discussion or invoke some of you who haven't submitted already to perhaps submit to the inquiry. So the ideas I'm going to, there's lots to touch on in defence and military. I'm not going to be able to cover all of it. Lots of stuff that I've had to leave out, but just a couple of key things. The ANZUS Treaty, first and foremost, can't really discuss the alliance without discussing the ANZUS Treaty. I'm going to follow by talking a little bit about threats to the so-called rules-based order, which is kind of a new catchphrase amongst Australia's national security community, and you know what that means and what it doesn't mean. Can't really discuss the alliance in terms of its military and defence impacts without looking at Pine Gap, the heart of the alliance. So I'm going to kind of touch on that very briefly, and then I'll finish off by focusing on China. I think this has been a major concern amongst Australia's national security community and the public at large, and of course lots of media attention on this, and really can't discuss the importance, the costs and consequences of the alliance without thinking about the rise of China and what that means for Australia and the alliance. Okay, so if we're going to talk about the foundations of the alliance, of course we have to discuss the ANZUS Treaty. Oops, sorry, went forward one too many. So it's seen to be the cornerstone, widely promoted as the cornerstone or bedrock of Australia's alliance with the United States. It's depicted that way by Australia's national security community across the bipartisan political spectrum. The phrase cornerstone or keystone of Australia's defence foreign policy with respect to the ANZUS Treaty appears at least 300 times in Hansard from the 1950s to 2010s, according to one research paper. Scott Morrison recently called the ANZUS Treaty the single most important achievement of the Liberal Party ever while in government. So not only is it considered an important achievement in terms of Australia's defence policy, but in terms of Australia's political history. It's also considered a kind of symbolic representation of the so-called shared values that Australia and the United States share, values such as freedom and democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and so on. It's referred to as more than just an alliance, something that goes beyond interests and goes to values, a friendship and a commitment forged on the battlefield for over 100 years, and so on and so forth. And ANZUS kind of, you know, the idea is that ANZUS formalised this long-standing friendship. The idea of Australia and the US sharing mutual values was a much tougher sell during the Trump administration, but nonetheless, the attempt was made. So in reality, I think it's important to point out that the ANZUS Treaty provides only a very weak commitment to mutual defence. The ANZUS Treaty states that the parties will only consult together whenever there is a so-called threat to the peace. It's not a guarantee. Australia wanted a NATO-like guarantee during the negotiation of ANZUS, but only got a weak commitment to consult. Those limitations in the ANZUS Treaty reflect the specific interests of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the senior advisory body for military matters in the United States. Australia's diplomats pushed and wanted access to Pentagon's global strategic planning and how Australia might fit into that planning, where and under what conditions Australian forces would be deployed as part of America's kind of global war plans. But when the Joint Chiefs of Staff were told by Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State at the time, this is in the early 1950s, late 1940s, they had, quote, a sustained tantrum. The JCS wanted maximum Australian participation in any future war with minimal constraints and limiting US reciprocal obligations to defend Australia. So unlike other US alliances, the ANZUS text refers to attacks in the whole Pacific area, which would include attacks on US forces in South Korea and Japan or in Taiwan. It means that there is a far greater likelihood and a greater obligation on the smaller ally, Australia, to militarily aid the United States. And of course, the history of alliance warfighting has thus been Australia participating largely in US-led wars to defend against threats or challenges to American global hegemony, and not the other way around, whether that be socialism, communism, independent nationalism, terrorism, or whatever. So once again, in the present, ANZUS is being utilized by the US to bring Australia into its great power conflict with China, which it views as a threat to its military dominance of the region or its hegemony. We learned last year, as part of the annual AUSMIN consultations between Australia and the US, AUSMIN, the Australia-US ministerial consultations that happen every year as part of the kind of political infrastructure of ANZUS, that secret political military guidance or planning is being developed to coordinate Australian and US forces for conflict with China. Presumably, the planning would address things like the role of US forces based in Australia, including long-range American bombers, in any potential conflict with China, or the specific contingencies that might bring about their deployment and how Australian forces might also be expected to participate. Of course, the planning is secret, so we don't know what is contained in it. But the Australian and US militaries are already very highly integrated with one another in terms of interoperability, of equipment, doctrine, strategy. And this is solidified by very large and extensive wargaming exercises, which unfortunately I don't have time to go into today. But this addition of kind of political military guidance to coordinate the deployment of troops between both countries adds kind of a further degree of what is already very significant momentum and pressure for any future Australian leader to join the US in a conflict with China should some crisis that emerge. That momentum, that pressure, that integration makes it very difficult for any future PM to say no should the US request Australian participation. Okay, so these days we don't hear as much about the alliance as the cornerstone of Australia's security. We hear it every now and then, but we hear more about how indispensable the alliance is for securing a rules-based regional and global order. I'm sure you've heard of this phrase if you've been paying attention all to foreign affairs and foreign relations, particularly with respect to the US and China. This rules-based regional or global order is fairly poorly defined and debated. Supposedly it's based on liberal values of freedom and openness and the rule of law and participation and adherence to international institutions like the UN and WTO and so on, but it's never really clearly defined. In actual fact, support for the so-called rules-based order is often used as a kind of more palatable way for describing support for US strategic economic interests, given that it is the US that has largely crafted the rules of the international system for its benefit, and whose frequent and flagrant violations, quite frankly, of the rules are never portrayed as a threat to those rules or the foundations of those rules. Anyway, China, on the other hand, which I should say has been explicitly labeled by the Trump administration and even the Biden administration as a kind of revisionist state, is considered a major threat to the current rules-based international order. And Australia has more subtly expressed the same viewpoint. I want to address this because it's kind of an important element of Australia's defense of its kind of antagonism towards China and its further integration with the United States. The characterization of China as a threat to the global rules-based order, I believe, is highly misleading. even if one equates the rules-based order as defined by the United States, and as shown in the table on the slide there, China accepts many of the core rules and institutions of the international system. Yes, it rejects some too, but where it does reject elements of the current order, the departure is not unlike any other great power, especially the United States and even Australia on occasion, who rejects the international rules like UN arbitration over disputes with Timor-Leste or the invasion of Iraq or many others. So yes, China is building military features on disputed islands in the South China Sea, and that is a rejection of current norms. But then the US violates similar norms, actually more frequently, more expansively, and more egregiously throughout the entire world. And yet apparently it does so without demolishing or even posing a threat to the so-called free and open rules-based order. The point that I'm trying to make here is not that China doesn't pose challenges to some widely accepted international norms that Australians should and do value, or that even we should respond in some way, but that these challenges shouldn't be exaggerated to depict China as some kind of hyper-revisionist power intent on replacing US hegemony, upending the current international order, and opposing its authoritarian values around the world, which is certainly how the Trump administration depicted China and how the incoming now Biden administration has indicated it shares more than less of those same views. China is most concerned in its foreign policy with protecting its highly oppressive rule at home from external criticism. It's concerned about forging foreign relationships conducive to economic growth. It's not so concerned about exporting its model of authoritarianism abroad or reshaping the global order in its domestic authoritarian vision. China today is not like revolutionary China of the 1950s and 60s. China has, very real and important stake in the current kind of global capitalist system, of which it has derived many benefits and into which it is actually quite highly integrated. A point that I'll discuss in a little bit more detail later on. But yes, depicting China as this kind of revisionist power or a unique threat to the rules-based order is really a way for the US and Australia to kind of rationalize this desire to see Washington cling on to its position of hegemony. Okay, so I mentioned that we can't really discuss the costs and consequences of the alliance in the realm of military and defense without mentioning Pine Gap. So Pine Gap is really the heart or strategic essence of the alliance. It would be hard to imagine the alliance surviving without the existence of Pine Gap. It's much more important in a practical sense than the ANZUS Treaty. Pine Gap is probably the most significant intelligence gathering facility outside of the United States. Many of you are probably already familiar with Pine Gap and what it does. I'm not going to spend too much time describing its functions, but basically it serves to intercept foreign military and civilian communications, provide intel on the nature and location of foreign defense systems, track conventional nuclear missile launches, all of that which is fed back into the US coordinated globe-spanning Five Eyes intelligence network, as well as the US military for direct application on the battlefield, including controversially drone assassinations. The argument by Australia's national security establishment is that Australia couldn't hope to independently defend ourselves without the intelligence provided by Pine Gap. In fact, the late Professor Desmond Ball, the very influential and authoritative expert on Pine Gap, argued in the years before his death in the mid-2000s, that Pine Gap gives Australia everything and nothing. That is, it provides incredible amounts of intelligence that are useful mainly for US global military operations or Australian participation in coalition wars, but not particularly useful for our own defense needs and our own interests. The pivotal role that Pine Gap plays in providing actionable battlefield military intelligence for US forces means that there is no war the US can be involved in the Indo-Pacific or the Middle East without Australia's automatic participation through Pine Gap. And that makes additionally Australia a target of US adversaries, and particularly a target for a nuclear, ICBM. Look, there's lots more about Pine Gap that we could say, but there's no time to go into the details. I've put a link there to the Nautilus Institute's Pine Gap project, which is a fantastic resourcing in case you're interested to learn more about the importance of that facility. The only additional point I want to raise this evening about Pine Gap is kind of to bring your attention to its kind of changing purpose once again. As during the War on Terror, when Pine Gap was used to prioritize US military action in the Middle East, such as drone assassinations, today the Five Eyes intelligence network of of which Pine Gap is a key node, is being repurposed to fulfill America's great power competition with China. So according to a recent investigation by Bloomberg, with a dozen former and current Five Eyes intelligence officials, this new role of the Five Eyes intelligence network means that intelligence collected around the world will always have a Chinese angle, will always look for Chinese threats, just as we once saw events in Angola through the prism of the Soviet Union. In that respect, it is a kind of return to the Cold War. And so as with ANZUS, as with the new focus on the rules-based order, as with increasing defense integration between Australia and the US, Pine Gap and the Five Eyes Alliance is being kind of repurposed to suit primarily American great power interests. Okay, so the last, actually I'm just keeping an eye on the time. How much time do I have left, Kelly?
We have some flexibility, Vince, so keep going.
I've got a few minutes. Okay.
You
all right,
do.
good. It's just the last couple of slides. Okay, great. Just a few points about the supposed China threat before wrapping up, because as I mentioned before, if we're going to understand the contemporary costs and consequences of the alliance, we really need to understand the primary role of China in American strategic thinking. So the new Biden administration has made it clear that it intends to largely continue Trump's more assertive posture towards China, both militarily and economically, although with less crude rhetoric and a greater effort and finesse in mobilizing US allies. So militarily, the Biden administration is effectively resurrecting the pivot to Asia that was initiated by Obama, but incorporating kind of new Pentagon warfighting strategies developed during the Trump administration. So in particular, the Pentagon plans to distribute US forces more widely, more heavily across the Indo-Pacific, with a new role for the Army and for the Marines operating within and around what's referred to as the first island chain surrounding China, armed with kind of more mobile, long-range precision fires. Precision fires that had been prohibited by treaty until the Trump administration withdrew from that particular arms control agreement. Ostensibly, this new or increasing military encirclement of China is required to neutralize, China's short and medium-range missile advantages in China's near seas, and thereby prevent what's referred to as a fait accompli, which basically means the concern is that China may initiate a kind of rapid military attack on Taiwan and then dig in before the US can move in sufficient forces to repel the attack. That's the kind of justification. When the head of Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral Phil Davidson, presented his $27 billion Pacific Deterrence Initiative earlier this month to Congress as a budget request to beef up America's military presence around China in the form that I just described, he raised the alarm that China may attempt to invade Taiwan in the next 6 years. This kind of statement is pure threat inflation to justify further militarization of the Indo-Pacific in order to maintain US primacy or military dominance. China is not on the verge of invading Taiwan. China's preference is to deter independence rather than compel unification by force. That is not to say that there are not legitimate concerns about China's use of coercion and political warfare to try and pressure Taiwan, probably to negotiate a reunification deal on Beijing's terms sometime in the future. But that's fundamentally different from concerns about an all-out invasion, which remain an incredibly costly proposition for China and would perhaps do irreversible damage to the CCP's, China's Communist Party's, reputation and legitimacy, especially if it were to fail. Xi Jinping is perhaps less risk-averse than other recent Chinese leaders, but he's not about to embark on an irrational, military invasion of Taiwan. And similarly with China's kind of regional military strategy more broadly, it's not about kicking the US out of the Indo-Pacific. It's about responding to decades of weakness when the US could project force right up to China's shores militarily and dominate in China's near seas. China's military strategy is about responding to US intervention, not denying the US military access to the entire region, which it doesn't have the capacity to in any case. Washington's kind of choosing to depict China's attempt to balance against the US and its near shores as a threat to the entire regional balance in US national security interests in order to rationalize its own kind of desire to maintain primacy. Okay, so last slide. I just want to finish up on the other so-called threat from China, which is the economic threat. once again here, the idea that China is posing a threat to Australia, to the region, and to the US global economic supremacy is vastly exaggerated. We're experiencing at the moment current trade restrictions over the past year, but those trade restrictions in fact demonstrate the limitations of China's economic coercion. Despite restrictions on barley and beef and wine and timber and coal, imposed by China, and we can talk about the reasons why that is, perhaps if you're interested in the Q&A. Australia's overall dollar value exports to China are actually booming, and this is largely a result of increases in the value of iron ore exports to China, which have been conspicuously left off the trade restriction list. Australia recorded actually its second highest ever level of goods exported to China in 2020, 148 billion, which is a few billion less than 2019, but 10% more than 2018, which was the third biggest year. The reality of what's happening here is that China has no realistic alternative when it comes to iron ore, which is by far the largest share of value in Australia's exports in China. And so while it's not negligible, China's economic power, there's a lot of exaggeration about China's capacity to engage in kind of economic coercion of Australia, particularly in order to extract political gains. In fact, it's had the opposite effect, as we've seen. Business has largely fallen into line with the government, and kind of nationalist anti-China rhetoric, continues to dominate the public discourse. Australia is not changing tack at all. Okay, so that picture that I've got up on the slide there, just to demonstrate a kind of comparison with the United States. I mean, no one talks about the economic leverage held by the United States over Australia. China's economic leverage pales in comparison to the United States. America's cumulative investment stake in Australia is 10 times as large as China's. And in fact, the majority of Australia's biggest companies are owned by US investors and shareholders. That graph there is taken from some research done by Professor Clinton Fernandez. China's capacity, to use its economic coercion to extend its political and strategic influence in the region is also frequently exaggerated. It's claimed, for example, that China poses a threat to the sovereignty of nations by engaging in what's called debt trap diplomacy, ensnaring countries with loans they can't repay, and then when they default, China goes in and seizes certain strategic assets like ports for use by the Chinese Navy. This is just pure fabrication. Several studies have demonstrated that this whole debt trap diplomacy concept doesn't exist. There's one most recently published by Chatham House, which I'll provide a link to on the slide there. There is no grand geostrategic objective driving China's Belt and Road Initiative. It's significantly economic drivers that underpin China's initiative, created by China's kind of serious overcapacity problems at home. The anticipated decision by the Morrison government to ban Victoria's BRI agreement or memorandum of understanding with China outright because of security or geostrategic concerns really makes no sense, except in the context of fear-mongering on domestic political purposes. If you're interested more in reading about this myth about BRI and debt trap diplomacy and China's kind of geostrategic ambitions through economic coercion, you can follow that link on the slide. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit more about the supposed myth of just to wrap up in a minute or so, because I know I'm over time here. Just quickly, the biggest myth of all, which is that China is on the verge of replacing the US as the world's largest and most powerful economy. This, of course, fuels fears about concerns, of China translating its economic power into strategic power and political influence. But the truth is that while China is certainly a powerful global economic player, it just doesn't have the same structural economic power at present necessary to challenge US primacy, and it faces significant obstacles ahead in the future. Over the past 30 years or so of neoliberal globalization, particularly since China's accession to the World Trade Organization, Chinese impressive economic growth through foreign direct investment has had stunning impacts, positive impacts, but it's come at the expense of an incredible level of ownership by US and other Western corporations. Something like 80% of the most dynamic and technologically advanced sectors of China's exports are dominated by joint ventures and, in fact, mostly wholly owned foreign subsidiaries. So even in the domestic market, there are several key sectors dominated by foreign corporations. And I've got a couple of graphs here on the next slide, which you can have a look at in more detail if you like, describing that process or that fact. But yes, China's integration into global financial markets has actually increased over the past year, even despite the trade restrictions imposed by the Trump administration. Companies like PayPal, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, American Express, BlackRock, and other big financial companies have all increased their access over the past year in China's stock and bonds. Foreign ownership currently sits at 837 billion, which is an 8-fold increase since 2014. The point that I'm trying to make here is that this kind of level of penetration and dependence on a foreign, especially US capital, is not indicative of a rising, economic hegemon. While China is, and the Trump administration's attempts to cripple China's high-tech sector with bans on semiconductors and the like demonstrate, how the US still maintains structural economic power and the vulnerabilities inherent in China's attempt to, develop under a kind of US-led neoliberal globalization. So China is relatively geopolitically independent. That's from the US, that's certainly the case, but it's still very highly economically dependent and highly integrated into kind of US global capitalism. That doesn't mean it won't be able to break free of that dependence, perhaps, and become kind of self-reliant in key technologies in the future. It's clearly trying to do this, as well as, overcome serious domestic economic problems like a shrinking workforce and aging population. But whether it can do so or not, remains to be seen. We're certainly not there yet, and the indicators aren't particularly positive. Okay, so I might leave it there. Apologies, Alison, for going over time.